Yeah, so I think the bill you're talking about was passed a few years ago, and it did increase the diameter that can be cut only in a portion of the state. I think it was primarily in the Sierra Nevada. Dave, I think
Right.
they called it the LaMafa bill, but it was actually, I think, Assemblymember Dolly that
Right.
introduced it, and it was passed. And it was in reaction to the large fires, allowing for larger diameter to be cut. I mean, I think in your typical forest, it's not a matter of needing to cut larger trees necessarily, and again, particularly on public lands. It's really about getting the ground fuels removed, so the shrub, the small diameter. What you'll see is that there's a need to take some of those bigger trees. Sometimes it makes sense for forest health. Sometimes it just makes the economics work. So you'll see that there may be some trees cut in order to pay for the project. And our federal government's terribly underfunded with all of this.
Right, I mean,
Yeah.
that was the idea, is that there's, the law says that if you go in there and you thin, you gotta take out everything. So you try to provide an economic incentive, especially if the situation seems to be acute with the longer burning forest fires and
Right.
an increased amount. And, we haven't got to the health effects from the people down in the flatlands, as you indicated on your drive here this
Right.
morning. You see that layer of smog.
That's right. So more avoided costs,
Right.
and certainly with agricultural burning, but with the fires too. It's impacting the air shed here. So just to wrap up, I mean, some of the things that we're doing are looking at other products. So the bioenergy and just keeping these operating is really important, because these take, of the wood removed, over half ends up in a bioenergy facility in California. We have some light manufacturing. We're continuing to look at different industries, different products that we could potentially make out of the small diameter wood and brush that we're removing. Another option is some of the advanced biofuel technology. The Energy Commission has been funding. They have a couple funding programs really trying to promote that. I think it's a ways down the road, but it's starting to look more promising. We just had a presentation of a facility opening up in Lakeview, Oregon. They have contracts with Southwest Air and FedEx. But the interesting part about it is they're going to produce the product there, put it on rail to the Oakland port. So to me, that's a lost opportunity for California. We were asking them, well, what's it going to take to get you here? So I think that there's a lot of interesting things going on. Biochar is another product. It's the byproduct of combustion. Actually, here in Merced, there is a half megawatt facility, primarily using more urban wood. But for a while, they weren't making any money selling the energy, so they just unplugged and they produced the biochar. They were selling the biochar as a soil amendment. There's also opportunities as a water filter. So there's things percolating, but the industry isn't established, and we have this huge supply and glut. So we're needing to get out ahead of it. And I think like concerted efforts in economic development in these industries is really critical. Just like we did in the recycling industry years ago, actively seeking users of aluminum and different plastics as we were collecting it on the curb. I think it's the same kind of thing we need to do here.
What would a local biochar, I'm trying to think of, in an urban area, in an agricultural area, in a foothills area, you want to inspire these entrepreneurs. I know I have a friend that has one for the backyard just for her garden, but I guess it would be, you would serve as a facility like you would the recycling center. You get your environmental crowd to collect the product, do the biochar, and then have people love that free giveaway. Here's the biochar. It's April 2nd or whatever the date is. It's interesting.
Right? Yeah. That's a neat idea. There's an example on the North Coast where a nonprofit is producing biochar. Mm-hmm. They're selling it to one of the big locally owned nurseries, and that's the only soil amendment they sell, and they have a market. So I think some of the small scale is what we're going to have to go with in the near term, and that was a good idea. Another action, so there's a forest carbon plan. Part of the AB 32 scoping plan called for CAL FIRE Natural Resources Agency and Cal EPA to lead a forest carbon plan. We're well into that. Our deadline is the end of next year. In that, we're really going to be looking at what are the most effective ways to manage our forests so that we store the largest amount of carbon, we reduce the risk of these large fluxes of emissions due to fire and open pile burning. And then I think the biomass management is going to be a big piece of this. Like, what are the best uses, the highest uses for the material we're removing from the forest, and how do we incubate those industries in order to really have a market? And then there's multiple other policies, but I'm not going to go into that, and if you have any questions, please let me know.
Okay. Thank you. Let's turn to David Hsu.
Good morning, and thank you for having us. I just stated my name is David Hsu. I'm a staff chief with CAL FIRE. I work with the Office of the State Fire Marshal, a branch of CAL FIRE, and my job is to be the overseer of the planning and risk analysis branch of the Office of the State Fire Marshal. And probably the biggest component of that division in OSFM is overseeing the strategic fire plan for the state of California. It was a document that was adopted in 2010 by the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. And in essence, it is a document that is largely looking at how we deal with the fire problem in the state of California. There's a lot of talk that's been discussed up till now about the issue of the various fires that have been going on. And so I want to really focus my presentation to you on the vision of that fire plan and our prevention efforts that are that we're working on and trying to mitigate some of the impacts of the fire environment. If you'll excuse me, I've been actually on the Valley Fire last week as working in Lake County on that fire, and was actually there on Saturday afternoon when the fire came through Middletown, and it was a pretty devastating event to be at. So I have some firsthand knowledge that I can share with you on some of the impacts of these things right up front. And of course, they're still working on that fire. People are still today returning to their homes and to see if they have a home to live in or not. The vision of the fire plan really, and I can read it to you, it really is summarized by two simple statements. And it states, it's a vision for a natural environment that is more resilient and a man-made assets that are more resistant to the occurrence and effects of wildland fire through local, state, federal, and private partnerships. So in a nutshell, we're really breaking it down to two things. We're looking at how to make the natural environment more resistant to wildfires, and how our man-made assets are going to be more resistant to the effects of wildfire. And I think it's important to understand the fact that right up front, that fire is as natural a part of the environment as air and water. It's been a part of the natural environment in the state of California for forever. And we have no sense that we're not ever going to eliminate fire from the landscape. So how do we live more successfully with the fire? How do we develop development? How does development continue by making it more safe for people to live in that fire environment, by making it more safe for firefighters to go in and help people evacuate safely when these events occur, because they will continue to occur. So there's a number of things that we've gone about by trying to deal with these long-term impacts and how to start addressing the current strategies that are out there. One of them that I want to point out is Senate Bill 1241, which was passed in 2012. In it, CAL FIRE was instructed to essentially create a land use planning branch that would work with our local and county government partners in providing higher levels of fire safety measures into their general plans, and specifically into their safety elements as future development occurs. And what that is doing is CAL FIRE employees are working hand in hand with local planners throughout the state in looking at guidelines by the Office of Planning and Research and putting in more effective fire safety measures, so as future development occurs, it will be done in a way that is more safe for people to live there, including both landscape issues, evacuation routes, travel routes, water resources, and also the structures and the codes that are used for the building and the construction to make structures more resistant to the effects of wildfire.
But, I mean, I have a elementary understanding, but I know back in the day before we were here, and there's just the native Californians, wildfires occurred periodically. It was every 7 years. There was, and sort of CAL FIRE's charge is to put out the fire. At least those of us in the urban centers, they put out the fire. And I grew up in the first Earth Day that we were supposed to protect all the trees, and we were supposed to make sure that not one of them gets knocked down, right? We had the old growth forest. I mean, there's many people in my neighborhood thinks that the whole state of California is an old growth forest. How do we recreate that cycle of fire manually? I mean, there's gonna be some fires, and we still gonna, because there's real property there, or property that people care about, there's gonna be the desire, we're fighting to put the fires out and protect things, but how do you recreate the effects of what would happen every 7 years or 8 years when a fire would come in, and the Native Americans, they would light the fire. They'd start the fire and say, well, this is time, it's too much growth, we gotta get it done. We don't have that type of thinking.
You're right. It is a mindset, and you are right. We were charged with being good at putting fires out, and I have to say that we've gotten very, very good at it. We are very successful in suppressing fire ignitions. And in fact, you bring up, it was a perfect segue, thank you for bringing that question up, because it is another point that I wanted to bring up. So prescribed fire, man-made fire activity, is another tool in which we're exploring. In fact, Senate Bill 2465, which was vetoed by the governor last year, was an effort at creating a model for introducing more prescribed fire into the landscape. But there were some critical components missing, and the governor recognized that. But in his veto language, he discussed and basically directed CAL FIRE to work with our local partners, the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council, our federal partners and local governments, the Air Resources Board, and other stakeholders in this, to basically find a way to do exactly what you're suggesting, introduce more controlled and prescribed fire into the environment. As you've heard over and over again, the amount of fuel that has built up over the years in the state is excessive at this point. And that is why, when we see some of these fires starting, the amount of fuel is the primary source, being pushed by the wind, of why these fires explode into such catastrophic events. In the old days, Native Americans certainly did light fires, but because they did it so frequently and so routinely, the amount of vegetation on the ground was kept at a much, much lower level than what we currently see. And because of that, when they lit fires, it burned at a much smaller and lower intensity than what we see today. So consequently, because we have become so good and efficient at putting fires out, it has allowed that natural resource to grow and become thicker and more resistant to fire. And so when fire does start, especially in the drought conditions that we're seeing today, they can explode into, unfortunately, killer fires. And that's what we've just witnessed recently in these latest fires that are burning. So we are partnering with our agents. We're having meetings with them. In fact, we have another meeting scheduled tomorrow, in fact, to work with our partners in finding ways that we can all collectively introduce more prescribed fire into the environment. And we'll be working on that and bringing that forward to do exactly what you're suggesting. introducing a little bit more of what Mother Nature intended into the landscape. Of course, we have to do it in a manner where millions of people live today, where, of course, that wasn't a problem back in the day. So we have to address that also, and the air resources issues and all those things. So we have to find a way to do that. We have to find a way to compromise and everyone work together, because that is one way that can be very successful. By doing that also, it also works at going ahead and reducing the amount of carbon output that you see in the large destructive fires. If we are in control and put smaller fires in the landscape and reduce that fuel loading, it means that the larger fires will have less fuel to consume and therefore less carbon output, which then directly translates into protecting public health in a more resilient way. So it all ties together. You're exactly right. So looking at ways to try to go back and mimic some of what Mother Nature intended all along and what Native Americans knew for so long, I think we can be more successful in helping to create those natural occurrences. Another factor that I want to bring up is, of course, you mentioned it earlier, the state responsibility area fire prevention fee. That was imposed and initiated and implemented in 2011. It's been in place for 4 years now. And it has done an amazing job of, for the first time ever, providing a consistent and reliable revenue source for the department to work on the prevention activities that we are now doing. And I can state that we have provided more prevention activities within the past few years because of that revenue source than we ever have in the past. And last year, we were approved to have a $10 million grant program that fire safe councils and local fire districts are now using to create fire resistant and fire prevention projects. We have another $5 million that we hope the application phase will open next month and put more money into fire prevention projects. We've created a report, an information report on the fire prevention fee that is available to break down for the past 3 fiscal years exactly how the money has been spent and what we've spent it on. But it has really garnered a lot of cooperation between the elements of CAL FIRE, of course, the large response network of the people responding and suppressing the fires, the resources wing of our fire, and the prevention wing of the CAL FIRE branches. So all of those are working in conjunction with our local partners much more closely than we ever have before. And the vision of all of this is that these prevention efforts work. We know for a fact that right now we are having approximately 1,600 fire ignitions right now this time of year than our normal 5-year average. That's a lot more fires than we normally see. Now, of course, we have, unfortunately, some very large, devastating fires that are on the record books right now. However, the reason there's not more, you would ask yourself, if there's 1,600 more ignition starts, why aren't there even more large fires? Well, I would say that, again, we're very good at putting fires off. We have a very aggressive, very professional organization with both CAL FIRE and our local partners and federal partners, and we're very good at an aggressive initial attack. And we are hearing feedback as we begin to put these prevention projects and are being more aggressive at getting those on the ground. We hear feedback from the troops in the field saying, a fire started and it burned into a control line, a defensible space line that was put along a roadside or around a community, and it helped them extinguish that fire instead of it escaping into a large catastrophic event. Mm-hmm. Those are the things no one hears about because they don't make the news. They're a small, isolated little incident that goes away. And that's why we're having so many more ignition starts, but fewer larger fires. So we know anecdotally that those prevention activities work. We also know, unfortunately, from these large fires, we're being very aggressive with inspection teams that are combing through the fire area and not only identifying the cause of many of the structures that have burned, but also looking at the structures that survived and recording what caused those to survive. And when we look at the Chapter 7A wildland urban interface codes that require more resistant construction and better venting systems, better roof materials, all those factors, they do have a positive effect, and we are seeing structures that are surviving as a result of those. So collectively, when you start looking at all of these things, we are gathering the statistical data that is going to prove quantitatively what we know anecdotally, that the prevention efforts work. And collectively, through the strategic fire plan and unfortunately going through these events, we're going to be able to be even better at bringing suggestions and recommendations of how to put better prescribed fire, more prescribed fire on the ground, how to work with our local government partners in their land use planning efforts and have a more resilient future in the state of California.
Well, thank you. Let's turn back to the chaparral, because I know that in the grasslands, when the sheep farmers came or sheep herders came, the sheep would pull out the roots of the grass, and then that allowed for the replacement of the grass with the chaparral. That choked out the grasses and really made the cattle people mad. And there were those great fights in the history of California between sheep grazers and cattle grazers. Now it seems that we have in the up at the top of the mountain, we have, because of these forest fires are coming in, the tree population is not able to regenerate because you've created, I think you referred to it as a moonscape, Deputy Carr, where you have this devastated area, and then what does grow is the chaparral again. It's California, it's always been there. It just has never been able, in a forest environment or a grassland environment, grow into such, and then it creates different problems because you're going to have species of animals that would live in the forest, but also that's a nasty little fire when the chaparral's there, because that gets hot. What can we do if we're looking at resiliency policies? How do you make sure that when we do have a devastating rim fire or lake fire, that we get an aggressive forestry, or we make sure that the forest comes back? I mean, what are we learning, if we're learning anything?
Certainly part of our efforts are reforestation after the fire. And we have seed banks waiting in reserve for reforestation around some of these areas. Certainly some of the fire prevention fee efforts and things are going to be looked at. Of course, some of the grants that we just issued last year were proposed to remove vegetation around certain communities that unfortunately have now been affected by these fires, and quite frankly, all the vegetation they were planning on removing is now gone. And so we are going to be looking at maybe we can use that money to better help rebuild and reforest or repopulate that landscape in a more resilient manner that will help reduce erosion, all of those kind of things. You're exactly right, and all these partners that we have, the Chaparral Institute, all of these people are partners and stakeholders that we have to bring into the mix when we're having our discussions on prescribed fire and all those kind of things. Right now in Lake County's been hit devastatingly hard this summer. This is the third large damaging fire, the Valley Fire, that they've had this summer. But even as early as last week, there are quite literally hundreds and hundreds of trees that are being removed right now as we speak because of their danger of falling across roadways and helping residents go back safely to their homes. The state-owned Boggs Demonstration State Forest was 99% consumed by this fire, completely consumed. So we are going to be discussing how do we deal with that? How do we rebuild that forest, which has been in existence for many, many, many years? But it's all changed now. And obviously our strategies and how we move forward with this and rebuild a forest environment that has been so hit so hard is going to be a challenge for everybody.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you have the predictive challenges with extreme weather, whether it's too much rain or more drought, or the irregularity.
Right.
That it'd be hard to sit here for 10 years and say what the rainfall patterns are going to look like, and how do you interface that with a healthy regeneration of a forest. Well, thank you. Thank you for
Thank you.
that segment on state adaptation. You guys are dismissed. No, thank you. Thank you for coming. Let's go to our third panel, which are our regional adaptation efforts. I'd like to call up Nicole Morgan, who's with the Supervising Water Resources Control Engineer on behalf of Andrew Alvagat, and Tom Gordon, Senior Policy Advisor with the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District.